So now we were at the courthouse, and the guards start yelling, "Okay, ladies, start walking off the bus." I stood up, handcuffed to the other inmates, and I began my walk down the side of the bus and then down the steps. A set of steel doors open, and there was an entrance to a metal detector that we all had to walk through. There were about 6 male guards yelling and teasing us as we walked through that metal detector one at a time. I I tried my best to curve a smile as I walked by each guard, and then they began yelling, "To the left, against the wall, don't turn around." I faced the wall, and I waited for the guards to unlock the cuffs and the chain belt so that I could go into another holding cell. They crammed about 30 of us women into a small cell, and I hurried through the door so I could grab a bench. That way I wasn't sitting on that dirty, nasty, scuffed up concrete floor. I mean, it was kind of like the one that I was in while I was waiting on the bus to pick us up and carry us into San Diego. They made us wait in that cell until our name was called. And I was the first one. They were like, "Weeks, Miller." I stood up. I was so excited that I was going to be first that maybe that meant that, okay, I would get to see the judge and then I would be going home. So the door opened. We exited, me and the other female inmate exited the holding cell, and then we were told to face the wall again. We went through the same routine before being cuffed, and then we were walked down several hallways. One of the hallways was lined up with holding cells for male inmates, and as we walked by, they were yelling just perverted and obscene things to us. And I just tried to turn my head, act like I didn't hear them. And then we went into a small cell where there were 2 seats on one side, then there was a glass window, and on the other side, it was kind of like a door for the public defender to come in and talk to us. So we waited in the chairs, and I wanted to take my cuffs off so bad, but we still had to sit there cuffed. So I see a female walk in, and she said, "Miss Miller." The woman in the cell with me took a seat and was face to face through this glass window with this female public defender. And then you had a phone that you picked up on your side and they picked up on the other side so they could talk. And there was no compassion coming from this public defender or any understanding. And she stood up before walking out of the door, and she just said, "We'll just see what the judge has to say." A few minutes later, an older man walks in there, and he closes the door and he says, "Weeks." I walked over to the phone and I picked it up, and he said, "Miss Weeks, you're being held in Las Colinas Women's Detention Center on a fraud warrant that's out of Georgia." I said, "Yes, sir, that's correct." He said, "Well, I need you to sign this waiver giving Georgia the permission to transport you back to California, or from California. It usually takes a week, but it can take up to 2 weeks before they pick you up." So I took his pen, I signed the waiver without even reading it, because I still couldn't get out of my head a week, possibly 2 weeks, when 2 days prior I was told you'd just be here a day or two at the most. and now we're talking 2 weeks. And he turned around and he said, you'll be seeing the judge, and you'll get more information after the judge goes over your case. That cell door was open, and I was led down another hall and into another small cell that faced the courtroom. The AC was blaring, and I was freezing, shaking on the inside while waiting on that judge to show up. And I probably sat there at least 30 minutes. I sat down in the chair and I watched over in the courtroom, just hoping that the judge would release me that day and my friends could come pick me up. And then, all rise. I stood up and I got directions from the court. And it was the public defender said, Judge Taylor, this is Brittany Weeks. She's been held here on a fraud warrant from Georgia. She is aware that signing this waiver gives Georgia the permission to pick her up in California. Miss Weeks, the judge spoke to me. He said, I'm signing this waiver, and it's going to expire March 12th. Okay, this was February 21st. He said, I've never heard of it taking that long to be picked up. He said, so this should work. And I sat back down and I was like, that's it. I mean, it was after 9 a.m. and I was so exhausted. I'd been going at it since 4:30, eating breakfast, lining up, waiting in a big holding cell for a couple of hours, and then getting on a bus and taking a ride into San Diego, and then going in, another process of being searched and put in another holding cell to come out to go in another cell. I mean, I was so freaking tired. And I had no idea when I was going to get to leave California and head home. I missed my son. I missed my friends. I missed my family. And there were still people that didn't even know that I was in there. I mean, it had only been 2 days. The guard opened the door and walked me back down the hallways and back to that original holding cell with the other 30 women. And I walk in and they're like, what'd the judge say? And I said, well, they said they're going to give this waiver to Georgia for them to, pick me up, give permission to pick me up. And, damn girl, you're going to be all right. You'll bond out as soon as you get to Georgia. And every time I would hear that statement from that day forward, there was always this uneasy feeling and this gut feeling in my pit of my stomach that I just wasn't gonna get out like I was being told. I just knew it. I knew there was something else that was gonna happen. And so the noise was getting louder in that cell, and half the women were on the floor because of the lack of seating. And one of the women, actually the one that was sitting in front of me on the bus ride, the one that was real loud and talkative and who had prayed for me, she pressed the button because there was a speaker system, and you could press the button and you could talk to the guards and officers, and it's like she had no fear. And she said, there's too many of us in here. It's not fair that we're having to sit on this nasty ass floor. And I'm like, man, that is brave. I just couldn't even imagine trying to take up for myself or anybody in there, not after what I had seen in 2 days. Shortly after that, though, there were 2 guards that opened the door and they split us in half and put us in another cell that was next to the one we were in. And I ended up sitting right next to this woman that was so talkative all the time. And she looked at me, and I mean, now that I'm just talking about the story, God just put the right person in my path at just the right time. And she said, I used to have the life that so many people dreamed of. She said, my dad bought me everything I wanted, and when he died, he left me $1.5 million. And she said, I was hurting so bad because I was his baby girl. And she said, so I took the money and I blew it all on drugs. I have nothing left. And she said, it's gone. And she said, I have nothing to show for it. And she said, now I'm in here over and over and over for crimes that I commit in order to supply my drug use. And she didn't mind being open and honest about where the behavior was coming from, but she had no idea how to change that behavior. And she just cried and cried, sitting next to me and sharing that piece of information. And I just wanted to cry for her. I knew that pain. I knew the behaviors of mismanaging money in order to get some temporary relief from the unprocessed grief. Those words of hers, they really hit a deep spot in my heart. I would buy things and spend money in order to get that temporary relief from the pain of losing my granddad, losing my brother to suicide less than a year prior. And there was nothing I could do about it. The guards came to the door and they started handing us out these brown paper sacks. It was almost noon, and I hadn't had anything to eat since 4 a.m. And so it was bologna and cheese sandwich with 2 cookies, a milk, and an apple. After 2 days of observing the jail life, I saw the importance of wanting to feel loved and to be a part of a tribe or a community. Some women use prostitution, sex trafficking, drugs with other addicts, and even repeatedly coming to jail. And I just thought, what, we all want to be a part of a community with people that we can trust to share our love with. And I listened to several stories as one by one these women were taken in and out of the cell to see the judge. A woman comes in and she's like, they're going to give me 20 years for fucking shoplifting at Home Depot. And another one says, if you'd have had a good lawyer, this never would have happened. And then she was like, 20 years. She said, I'll be almost 70 years old. My husband's not going to wait on me for 20 years. And she was just pacing in that cell. And she tried to look tough, but that contraband eyeliner was just streaming down her face with every tear. There was a nice looking male guard that kept walking by trying to get the attention from the women, and you would see that a lot too. And some of the women would play into it, like, look at that sexy motherfucker, hey, look over here, sexy. And he'd smile and he'd turn towards the wall, and then he would shake his head as though he was enjoying it. And there wasn't a clock for us to look at, and just like in jail. And so finally the bus showed up, and it was the same drill as leaving the jail to get to the courthouse. We all lined up against the wall. We placed our hands on the wall, and we looked forward. We were chained together in twos, and we were loaded back on the bus. And several inmates, once we got on the bus, they were just, turn up the radio. Like, everybody wanted to hear music because you sit in jail and heard nothing other than the TV that you could turn on during day room time. And so they finally turned on the music, and again, I just sat and looked out my window and imagined what it would be like to be free and go and eat wherever I wanted to, as much as I wanted to. When we returned back to Las Colinas, we were led off the bus. We weren't uncuffed when we got back into the jail. And they brought us back into that holding cell, but then they would bring us out several at a time, and we had to go through that strip search again. It was a process again. But while I was in there, I met a woman named Melinda from California, and she was in there because she was a felon and she got caught making medical marijuana oils, and you can't do that as a felon in the state of California. But she told me that she was an energy healer, and it was just so cool that there I was crossing paths with another energy healer. And so she said that she believed in praying for world peace, and I explained I had been doing energy work since 2007, and that I'd love to meet up with her, once we were out of there. And she said, girl, she said, listen to me. She said, we are in a place full of spiritually sick women for a reason. She said, you be humble as a healer. This place needs our light. And it just, chills went across my body. And then I heard weeks. So the deputy opened the door and motioned for me to go into that same area where I was booked 2 days prior. Take off everything, rake your hands through your hair, pull back your ears, lift up your tongue, hold up both your breasts. Now turn around, bend over, spread your cheeks. And my hands were so hesitant when I had to bend over again and spread myself for her to look at. I stood up. I took my blue uniform and I redressed. Tears were streaming down my face. And I walked out of that dressing area and I felt dirty, ashamed from all the violation that had happened to my body. And I had no choice in giving permission to her. None of us did. And when you come from a past full of sexual abuse, which most every woman in that jail was a victim of sexual abuse, and you can do the research, that's really what's in there. So that demand of stripping, exposing your body while asked to perform for these deputies was a major trigger. And as I was walking off again, this, officer, she just looked at me and said, what's wrong with you? And she saw me crying, and I just stood there in those blues and stained panties and transparent orange flip-flops, and I said, nothing, I'm fine. And I just kept my head down. But I wasn't fine. I was being fucking traumatized. That's what I was being. And it was just that same feeling I thought back to a 5-year-old girl. Not having enough authority or say over those men and being able to tell them to stop. And I was trapped. It was the same trap feeling. And I hated having to say I'm fine because it was so generic, but it was an acceptable statement. Anyway, so I lined up down the hall behind the other women, And I began walking back to the dorm. And by this time it was 6 p.m. and I was starving.